If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Glad you could join. I'm going to tell you a story, and then I'm going to talk to you about how it's applicable, and I'll set the stage for what I'm going to talk about in this episode. I was talking to a prospect about Attention Compass and implementing Attention Compass. And her primary objection seemed to be a misunderstanding of the role of formal planning in our work management system needs or in our work management system space. Now, she had tried to implement bits and pieces of things that she'd picked up from Google or YouTube, basically what I consider to be legend and lore, but nothing she had tried had worked for her. And she felt that work of trying to implement systems, of trying to incorporate those tips and tricks into systems had been wasted and at some level had given up to some degree. And I think this is a common pain point. I think we've seen and heard so much about productivity and tips and tricks. We've tried many things and we're jaded, we're tired, and really don't know what to believe and what to take on face value. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about the notion of work management systems. And I'm going to trace some of the background. This will be sort of an origin story. I'm going to trace some of the background of Attention Compass as a work management system. And the takeaway is going to be an understanding of why work management systems differ, what a work management system is, and how you can apply that in your own thinking about developing your own work management system. In addition to pain points around tips and tricks and tried and failed, there's also a lot of thinking, it seems, about what suits me, what system suits me. And that really gets down to, well, how do I feel about this? How do I understand that this is going to be something that works for me so I can commit to it? And again, what I'll argue here is that work management tactics, processes, systems are something that has actually been thought about a good bit and researched a good bit. And for that reason, I'm confident that Attention Compass and really all of what I teach about personal information management, personal task and attention management, I think is well grounded in what we know about work management systems. A lot of what I see is people that are relying on kind of a PMI thinking. I'll describe what I mean here. Rigorous planning and precise estimating of things. And I'll tell you the story of larger teamwork management systems that have fallen along this very idea, this notion of rigorous planning, estimating, and scheduling versus a notion of more iterative work and less formal planning and structure. I'll argue that the more recent innovations, systems, are really more applicable to the kind of work that most of us do day in, day out. And I hope to be able to put some thinking into your hands that allows you to consider what you need in a more perhaps rational way than, well, you know, I like it or I don't like it, or it feels good or it doesn't feel good, that kind of thinking. So maybe that'll be helpful for you. And along the way, I'll talk about the theoretical foundations of Attention Compass and talk about how it's a complete, thought out, engineered system, which differentiates it completely from some bag of tips and tricks that have been unearthed. And also how, and I'll reiterate this, how it's much more applicable to the kind of work that most of us are actually trying to do. So we'll define the kind of work that we're actually trying to do. So that's the goal of this. And your takeaway will be some clarity about what a work management system is, some different kinds of work management systems, and some thinking about what's going to best apply in your world. Before we get into it in detail, I will ask you to shoot me an email. I've mentioned in previous episodes that our community is still small enough that I can personally address your concerns and I can answer your email. And I would love to hear from you. And of course, questions, ideas for episodes, all these different things are fair game for that email. If you've got feedback on how you enjoy the podcast or how it could be improved, I'd love to hear that. But if you don't really have any thoughts about all that, then please just take 30 seconds. Send me an email. I'm fixing to tell you what my email address is. Send me an email. Tell me your first name. Tell me where you are. And tell me roughly how long you've been listening to the show, because I want to build relationship. And so you can help me with that by putting your hand up and saying, here I am. I've been listening for a little while. And, we'll start a conversation. So I'll give you my email address. It's larry@dobusywrite.com. And I'll be real clear. It's Larry, my name, at dobusywrite, all mushed together, no spaces, no dashes.com. So I'll look forward to hearing from you via email. So I'll start off the meat of this episode with a brief history of what we call work management systems. I'll say that work management systems go back a long, long way. And work management systems tend to be team-oriented or organization level as compared to individual personal level. If we go back long enough, we can see all kinds of things, but I'll just start with the factory as a work management system. And the factory was built in such a way that it was pretty obvious where people needed to intervene in factory processes. And it was pretty clear what they needed to do. It was well defined, and it could easily be taught in most cases. Again, my common example is, hey, I don't have a robot that can put lug nuts on wheels. So I need a human to do it. Well, they need to come to work. They need to stand right here in this position. They need to use this tool to put the lug nuts on. They turn clockwise, right? Righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. And that's really clear and defined because the rest of the factory is an engineered system. And there are machines and tools that are doing things for us. And that means that there's not a huge amount of freedom of action for this individual. Now, if we go forward through that, then we get into kind of an engineered work phase where we built work management systems to help us with engineered physical product. Now, the heyday of this kind of work management system was the NASA program, military and governmental programs with these big, huge goals. And how do we accomplish a feat such as sending one or more people to the moon? Well, that's a pretty interesting problem, and some work management systems were developed in order to try to measure and monitor and make that work somewhat efficient rather than some sort of random set of engineers each trying their own way to do it. Interesting that prior to that were legendary efforts like the Wright brothers, who got out in their bicycle shop in Ohio and built an airplane and went to North Carolina to try to fly it where the winds were more favorable. And and they worked their own thing. They were doing their own engineering. They succeeded without a large team of people, apparently. But then you get into larger scopes of effort. And again, the space program is a great example where we had to have lots of people because this was a big job. And so what we did at that point was a very rigorous planning process, a very rigorous analysis process. And we tried to orchestrate and move all of the different resources in lockstep. We didn't want people sitting around doing nothing while other people had too much work that they could get done. And so we tried to build out systems in order to do this. And this is, I'll call this project management thinking. It's now represented mainly by the PMI, the Project Management Institute, and they've collected up project management thinking, and they've codified it, and they'll train you in it, and all these great things are going on. And that was kind of the state of the art. And then the 70s came along, and we started heavily investing from an economic standpoint, heavily investing the labor force in this new kind of building, which is computer programming, as a great example. And what we found is, and this is back to my own career, what we found was that a rigorous application of the PMI methodology was not a panacea to solving problems of delivery, to solving problems of efficiency, to solving problems of any management of this, I'm going to say, new field of human endeavor. And there was a fair amount of head scratching and why is this not working? And a fair amount of competing work management systems were developed. One of the primary ones that's lasted, I would say lasted the longest, is really an approach that doesn't rely on rigorous planning and estimating and scheduling and rigorous orchestration of teamwork. This system you may know as Agile methodology, sometimes called Agile project management. It also gets called Scrum, as Scrum is an implementation of, it's one implementation of these Agile management principles. And the Agile movement pretty much centered on the notion that human beings are poor estimators and poor predictors of the future. And really, when you get right down to it, human beings are poor planners in terms of this detailed long-term planning thing. And there are various reasons for that that we can get into, but I'll avoid that for our conversation right now. So really now what we have is two competing schools of thought. One system, the PMI system, has been as effective as anything we've ever done. And the Agile Scrum, and I'll just call it Scrum from here forward, the Scrum methodology really begins to do away with some of those bigger, more rigorous pieces in favor of flexibility and iteration and the growth of the product that was going to be produced. It's really interesting in hindsight because I've thought about this a whole lot. Part of this was my dissertation work at one point. And if we do a retrospective analysis of the two work management systems, then a couple of things I think really jump out to us. So one is the project management system of work management was developed within a particular context and reached its heyday in a very specific case of that context. project management grew up in the military ecosystem because NASA was governed as sort of a military governmental agency. And command and control was still very much a part of what was going on. So this is the planning phase, and the best we can do is estimate rigorously and figure out then, okay, how much work is there to do? How long is it going to take? Thus, when can we expect to deliver? But there are other features of the context in which PMI was created and was successful that we didn't think a whole lot about at the time. When we got into programming, we developed different kinds of work systems to help us with what is now clearly a fundamentally different kind of work. And this was not thinking that, to my mind, was happening at the time, but hindsight's 2020. So this is a retrospective analysis. So there's really two things that I think contributed to the differences and the relative success and failure of these two primary kinds of work systems. One is all of the things that the military was doing at the time are the ones that were big projects, were these engineered products in the physical world. What I mean by that is it's pretty clear if your goal is to put one or more people on the moon, that is a physical problem. And thus you address it with physical kinds of tools. You need to develop some vehicle that's going to deliver people over that distance. The vehicle needs to take into account the environment that you're passing through. In other words, it's going to have to bring its own oxygen. If you want people to leave the vehicle once they get to their destination, that is the moon, then you're also going to have to protect them from that environment. So we have spacesuits and different things like that. And then you're also going to have to bring these people back home. This could not be a one-way trip. And so just trying to illustrate the fact that most of the problems that we were dealing with at the time were these very physically oriented problems. Another part of the environment for PMI was this military governmental environment. And in that environment, again, retrospectively, there was not a rigorous cost-benefit analysis. And people still argue to this day about the benefits of the space program. And it has its supporters and it has its detractors. And we now know the overall cost in dollar terms of we wound up putting what, 25 people on the moon maybe? And the cost of doing that, and we now have seen some of the scientific advancements that we've achieved in part through those efforts. And there's now a retrospective cost-benefit analysis. But in military style work, there's the cost-benefit analysis tends to be subordinated to the overall goal. And the presumption, rightly or wrongly, is that the mission is worth whatever it costs. Now, that's not to say that NASA didn't try and control costs. They did try to control costs. But the ideas that were going around at the time, and again, retrospectively, were so huge and so grand that really budget was not that much of an obvious concern for people. So those two parts of the environment. Now, when we move over to this programming work, we see that it began in university and governmental research, but it quickly moved over into the business sphere. And thus it faced different constraints. So in business, there is almost always a cost-benefit analysis that's fairly tightly controlled. If a business is going to spend money, in order to make that decision, the business needs to understand how money's going to come back out. And a lot of that had to do with the efficiency of what we were trying to do, to keep people working, to not have a bunch of idle time, to figure out what specifically needed to be done and what could really not be done. So work that maybe was a good idea, but not absolutely necessary, was pushed to the side. And business became very focused on the efficiency of developing these new things in a more pointed way than was necessary in the government/military environment of NASA and the space program. So we started doing programming. The other interesting facet is that programming is really not an engineering kind of work. Programming is more of a knowledge work kind of work. And what I mean by that is that the results of a programming effort are not physical in the same way that the results of NASA were physical. There are several ideas wrapped up in this notion, and I'll try to detangle them a little bit for you. So one is the sheer physicality. So software code as a result of effort is amazingly changeable, malleable in a way that physical products really can't be. And the example is if you build a physical piece of steel for the spaceship and that physical piece of steel has a hole in it, well, that's a safety problem. And we've got to fix this hole. And does that mean that we need to scrap the whole part and start over? As compared to that, software is really amazingly changeable. It can be as simple as changing a document would be in your world. You know, you bring it up and you hit backspace a few times and you change the word. And the impact of this really, we didn't know it at the time, or at least I didn't. Maybe there were some scholars out there who were thinking about it. But the impact of that means that we needed a different style of work management system. And the result, the most prominent style of that different work management system is what we now call Scrum. Okay. So these two environments are very different, and two of the primary ways are cost-benefit analysis and the physicality of the product. There are also often very different levels of safety concern. It's unlikely that any software developer is developing a product that has life and death implications. Now, a nod to the folks out there who are doing the programming for pacemakers and different medical devices. But that's really a relatively small portion of the overall field of programming. And in many cases, an error or a problem in a piece of software code is simply not that costly. It certainly doesn't involve human life in almost all cases. And so because of these two different environments, again, in retrospect, it made perfect sense that we would develop a unique kind of work management system to handle this new kind of work and take advantage of the environment in which this new kind of work was happening and take advantage of the nature of the product that was being produced. So that's two primary differences. Well, the third is safety implications in some of these ideas. And there are several, but I just want to hit the highlights in our conversation here. So the alternative system, Scrum, was developed to take advantage, many would say accidentally, some would say purposefully, to take advantage of this new kind of product that was being produced. And a couple of the ways that Scrum took advantage of that, one was it took advantage of the malleability of software. So this increased, and I'm talking about orders of magnitude of difference in malleability. this increased ability to change things quickly and easily actually was initially considered to be a bug in software. And many of the software tools, as it turns out in retrospect, are to keep us from accidentally changing something and to make us make sure that a change is actually what we want. And if you look at that as compared to an engineered physical product, there's the difficulty of changing it is such that it presents its own barrier. It's really hard to, have a manufactured product, say your car, and then accidentally change it, and short of an auto accident. So it became obvious that this stuff was really easy to change, and we actually built tools to protect against accidental change. So as we're looking at this as one feature, then what Scrum recognized, or Scrum practitioners recognized, is that software could be developed iteratively in a way that physical product really could not. And so we could, in software, put out a product that we knew had certain flaws, that was less than perfect because there weren't safety issues, but there was tight constraint on cost benefit. And so we could do iterative work in a way that simply wasn't true and in physical product. And if you think about it, as humans, we do iterative work all the time in this environment where the cost of change is low and the risk of a poor performing product is low. So, for example, think about a book report that you did in school. And you would read the book, and the teacher said that it needed to be a 3-page book report. So you'd read the book and you'd write 3 pages. And then quite often you would go back to those 3 pages as a first draft, knowing that you weren't going to turn it in. You'd look at it and you go, okay, well, this is the product. What are its weaknesses? Let me change this in ways that make it better. And that's this iterative notion of work, which fits in very well in software development and is well accommodated, I would even say built into Scrum philosophy. So that's some of the differences. And a lot of people just don't recognize that this is actually kind of a big shift in our thinking. And it's really driven by the product that we're trying to produce. So a work management system that acknowledges the kind of work that's being done is quite sophisticated as compared to using a work management system that was developed in another environment for a different kind of product and then imported in. And we did spend, as software developers, we spent a lot of time thinking about whether our product was actually an engineered product. And one difference on this front is that engineered products can be heavily modeled. We've developed techniques for modeling physical products. We do mock-ups, we build miniatures in cheaper materials that help us reason about whether or not this product is going to be successful. And we've attempted to do some of those very things in software, but there's really not a terribly useful modeling language, as far as I know, for software. There's certainly not engineering principles like physics, like mathematical analysis in most cases that govern the nature of software. And so Scrum takes advantage of that. So that being said, I think we can look at the work that most of us do and pick between, is it physical, hard to change work that has huge safety implications, or is it more of a knowledge work product that's actually fairly easy to change and has low cost of mistake? And if so, then that'll help us pick our work management system to the one that best fits our environment. So when people think about work management systems, of which Attention Compass is one, then having some parameters to think about it, because I talk to lots of people who, for reasons that they may not even clearly understand, want to apply this rigorous planning to work where rigorous planning simply doesn't fit. It's not the best choice of mindset when we try to do this work. Now, the project management philosophy, the rigorous planning philosophy, was the first one out of the gate. And we thought that mature work management systems would, of course, include high levels of estimation, high levels of planning, lots of rigor. And then once we made the plan, we would just follow it. And the product that we got would be the product that we were looking for. So let's bring this out into the real world a little bit. The difference in rigorous versus iterative planning and work management styles is evidenced in everybody's kitchen. And it's a decent analogy, but it's not perfect. So there's a big difference between, in the kitchen, there's a big difference between baking and cooking. Okay. Baking is this rigorous chemical process that things combine in particular ways, and they're governed by physical law in a way that your stew pot is not governed. And so when we do work management processes for baking, they're quite rigorous. And we measure things carefully. Sometimes we use volume measurements. Maybe a more sophisticated baker will use weight measurements instead. I've heard this argument, oh, weight measurements are better. And different people approach this different ways. But really, philosophically, you follow the recipe, the plan when you're baking, and you don't deviate from it. And then in other kinds of cooking, the stew pot is an example. There's not this rigorous planning. There's more of an iterative approach. Okay, well, taste it. Does it still taste good? One doesn't typically in baking, as I understand it, one typically doesn't sample the dough in order to find out if there's enough flour in it. Versus a pot of chili, you sample the chili to see if there's enough salt in it. And so these two different schools of thought are really evident in lots of the work that we do. So this is not some abstract concept. It's a very personal concept. And it's interesting because if you look at it from this perspective, we see examples of it everywhere. Okay, we plan our driving trips fairly carefully because there are safety concerns. There's big cost of mistake, where in other areas of our lives, we don't plan rigorously because the cost of a mistake is low and the ability to change is easy. So when we look at our own personal work systems, I would argue that we need to take this difference into account, and we need to decide for ourselves what's the right way to go. And my argument is that for most of the work that we do, unless your work is baking or engineering or something like that, in which case you know it, then you use the engineering methodologies. You use the rigorous planning methodologies. And by rigorous planning, when I talk about baking, I'm talking about setting the oven for a specific amount of time, as compared to, say, cooking a steak, which is much more iterative and much more of a cook until it's done kind of philosophy. So when you look at your work, think about, is this an engineering process? Does it involve a physical product? Am I governed by the laws of physics when I produce this product? Or is it more of a, I'll say, knowledge work product where it's less tangible? It's more about our thinking. And if it's the second kind of work that you're engaged in, then this iterative approach, this do some work and see how it worked out kind of approach is probably the more useful. And I would argue that even if your work for pay is very much an engineered concept, then much of your work for other than pay is very much an iterative kind of work. Relationship work is very iterative because it's not governed by physical laws. It's not governed by math. So in that arena of our work, we very much engage in trial and error. Now, don't hear me say that this doesn't mean we're trying to get better, because we are. But there aren't engineering principles to fall back on to get this work done. So as you're thinking about your own work, and I would argue that you're almost definitely a knowledge worker, and that knowledge work falls into this non-physical space, then you want to choose your work management system accordingly. And that work management system is best described, at least as far as we know now, by Scrum kinds of principles. And as you're managing your work, you want to manage it according to those principles, because managing your work according to the wrong structure will result in, I would argue, poor results. Now, again, our legend and lore tells us that rigorous planning is required in order to succeed. And I would say, yes, quite often, but perhaps not always. And so we need to be open to different work management systems and different work management philosophies and tune them up to the work that needs to be done. So I would argue there is a small community, a somewhat small notion that goes under the name of personal Scrum. And it's Scrum principles that had been brought into the personal work management space. Now, I've argued elsewhere that because of various factors in our culture and economy, that we need to be more willing to adopt personal work management systems. And so I won't argue that here. But if we look into the Scrum philosophy, then we see other really good tools that we can bring in and utilize. But right now, I'm focused on the mindset. And the mindset largely has to do with iteration, because iteration is good for cost-benefit analysis often and in very specific ways. Okay. Iteration is almost always not the best calendar time management philosophy. I will argue that iteration is often needed to produce the best result, but it's not amenable to this strict kind of estimation and planning. Because what we're doing with iteration is we're exploring the nature of a good result. And we do some work, and then I'm going to use the word test it. And by test, I mean inspect, get feedback on, publish for comment, all these different kinds of ideas. So we do an iteration, and we have some inspection of that iteration. We identify some weaknesses, and we go back in and fix those weaknesses, rather than having a fully formed, rigorous plan of the different components of the work. So iteration is very important, I would say, in knowledge work. With iteration comes this Scrum notion that's referred to as minimum viable product. And minimum viable product is something of a mystery, often even to practitioners of Scrum. Minimum viable product, I would define it as the smallest product that addresses the problem well enough that you can get feedback. An example, if you're going to write a draft of a document and you want somebody else's feedback on it, then good grammar is probably part of that minimum viable product. because that has to do with the comprehensibility of your document. So if I have a great new idea and I publish it in a way that's not comprehensible, and some of you were saying, well, Larry, that's this podcast. I hope you're not saying that, but if you do, send me an email, larry@dobusywrite.com. And back to the minimum viable product idea. So the minimum viable is it has to be legible. So for example, if your reviewing audience does not speak English and you write a paper in English, that's not a minimum viable product for that audience. So kind of clarifying some thinking about minimum viable product, because I think people believe that minimum viable product is bad. It's sloppy work. It's not well planned and not executed. And I think if the concept is applied thoroughly, then I think we can understand the value of a minimum viable product. So that's one thing that comes out of this mindset of iteration. And again, I'll go back to the kitchen analogy. You know, you cook a steak with iteration. You put the steak in the oven and your minimum viable product is, well, it could conceivably be done in 10 minutes. So you ignore it for 10 minutes because it can't be useful until at least 10 minutes has passed. And then after 10 minutes, you start inspecting, i.e. checking the temperature or poking it with your finger or however you do that. And then you make the decision of, is it done or not done? Well, this is iterative methodology. Is it where it needs to be? As compared to a more rigorous methodology in the steak cooking realm, where you weigh your steak and you accurately measure the temperature of your oven and you do some physical math, and then you put the steak in and it cooks for 12 minutes and 38 seconds, and then you take it out and commence to eating. Now, is it possible to cook a good steak that way? Certainly. Is that the way we normally do it? No, because the effort involved in the planning is not necessary. It's of high cost, but it's not a necessity. Another Scrum idea that we take away is, if it's iterative, then there needs to be some rhythm to those iterations. There needs to be some rhythm to work. So we take periods of time where we focus on work. This in Scrum terminology is called a sprint. So we take periods of time and we do the work, and then we take a shorter period of time on a regular basis and we inspect the work. We do the work, we inspect the work. We do the work, we inspect the work. And our work management systems can adapt this thought process when we're doing knowledge work. So it's, let me do a draft that gets all of my thoughts out completely. Let me inspect that and see if there are any missing thoughts. Am I going to format the document at this point? Am I going to spend a lot of time setting it up for printing? No, I'm not going to do that, because it's an iteration. And then I'm going to take a look at that, right, in these work rhythms. So I'm going to spend an hour on it, and then I'm going to inspect it. And then I'm going to spend an hour on it, and I'm going to inspect it. So either working consistently for long, long periods of time, or inspecting too often, both of those are errors in our work management system. So we need to develop this rhythm of working and checking, working and checking. And that's built into Scrum philosophy, sprints, and they use all kind of fancy terms. Sprints, retrospectives, testing, which is showing it to an actual customer. So iteration presupposes, or iteration implies, that we're going to do these work periods followed by test periods. And this is something that we can also adopt in our own work management practice. Another notion in Scrum is, part of our testing is to also consider our production process and to check for the ways in which our work process challenges the production of a good result. Okay, process improvement, if you will. And we do take that time and we say, okay, well, it took me a lot longer to type this than I thought it would. Well, why? Well, I'm not a great typist. Well, how can I fix that? Well, I can learn to type. Okay. Well, do we spend 6 months learning to type and then get back to our work? No, we don't. We say, okay, well, I'm going to take a little typing training and then I'm going to use my work as practice for that typing training. And in much the same way, process improvement in Scrum is an active part of the work of each iteration of effort. And so all of these ideas then float back up to a more abstract version of a work management system, and we can bring those in and we can apply them to our own work, our personal work management system. Now, again, there is some thinking out there about personal Scrum, individual Scrum, all these kinds of ideas, and I think that's useful work. And where that comes in is that in Scrum philosophy, Scrum presupposes that there's a team of people working on the end product. A lot of Scrum ceremony, a lot of Scrum guidance is really about managing teamwork and managing multiple people that are trying to achieve the same one result. So when we're thinking about Scrum and we go, well, it's not applicable, I'll say, yeah, there are parts of team Scrum that are not applicable to personal or individual Scrum. For example, you don't need to hire a Scrum Master, probably, for your personal Scrum. And this is something that trips people up when they start thinking about Scrum, because they go, okay, well, that's a team process. I'm not a team, I'm an individual. I don't need all this heavyweight communication and work coordination process. And you're right, you don't. So that's the difference, I would say, between a team Scrum application and a personal Scrum application. So that's pretty much kind of the meat of what we're going to talk about. So I'll now move to application and I'll move to some recap. So application, and I've alluded to this a couple of times in this episode, application is to consider the kind of work that you do along the parameters that we've talked about. Is cost-benefit analysis important? And are you dealing with a physical product that's governed by the laws of physics? If so, then it's probably a good choice to get into more formal planning and to use the tools, modeling, mathematics, engineering principles that have been shown to be useful for that kind of work. If your work is not that kind of work, and I argue that much of our work is not, then you may consider more of an agile Scrum approach. Now, application, I will say that Attention Compass is heavily influenced by the principles of Scrum. And there are personal Scrum advocates who would say that Attention Compass is an implementation of personal Scrum and would understand it that way. Now, you don't have to drink the Scrum Agile Kool-Aid in order for this to make sense for you and for your work. So back to kind of a review. These principles apply to different kinds of work. I argue that most of the work that most of us do is not this engineered kind of work, or at least not primarily this engineered kind of work. That's true because we now have computers that we offload a lot of our engineering kind of work to. But that's another episode. So if our work is not an engineered product, it's more of a knowledge work product, then we want to do things like iteration. We want to do things like minimum viable product. We want to do things like work periods followed by measurement periods. We want to have a rhythm to our work so that we're not focusing on one at the expense of the other. And we want to build this in to our work management system. So as you think about that, I will say, again, Attention Compass is a great way to bring a more Scrum-oriented, a more agile approach into our work. Again, I'll say that I believe most people try to govern knowledge work with engineering work management processes simply because they don't know another way to go. And they've learned from history that there's really only one way to manage work, and that is this estimated, structured, planned methodology for work management. So in some ways, I'm trying to educate you about the alternative, which is more closely designed for the kind of work that more of us probably do. So that's a recap there. I want you to, so call to action, okay? Think carefully about the kind of work that you do. And think carefully about how your work management system works. Is it heavily planned? Is it estimated and then executed? Or are you engaging in more iterative work? And does that produce the kinds of results that you're looking for? At this point, efficiency is probably not a primary concern. But if it is, then there are arguments about how the iterative methodology is actually more productive. The iterative methodology is considered to, and I'll use their phrase here, maximize the amount of work not done. And this goes back to some previous episodes where we're thinking about perfectionism. And removing unnecessary work is the cornerstone of efficiency. So think about that as you're thinking about, well, what's the most efficient way to manage my work? And then now that you have this framework, you can look at different work management systems based on some structure, and you can decide which one is going to best suit the kind of work that you do. I'll ask again, please, for you to send me an email. And if you've got great ideas about the podcast or episodes, or you have a question, I'd love to hear those. If nothing else, just send me an email, tell me your first name and where you are, and maybe how long you've been listening. I'd love to hear from you, and start to develop some sort of a relationship. And I look forward to hearing from you here. So I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.